Hi, I'm Gabe, and today we'll be going over the history of spaceflight and the science behind rocket propulsion. So, this is the first episode in a video series I'm going to be doing, mainly on the topics I just said. The reason for this is both education for whoever is watching this video, and also to support a fundraiser for a aerospace college trip that I'm saving up towards, and the link for the fundraiser should be in the description of this video. So let's get right into this. So first off, rocketry has been around for a really long time. Like, you may know about the latest decade or so of space flight, all the greatest achievements such as the SLS launch lately, the Starship 33 engine test that they're finally doing, and looking farther back, things like the shuttle, the ISS, which is still actually under major expansion right now, although it's kind of ramped back a bit, even the Apollo program. But rocketry has existed for a lot longer of that. Even way before World War I. In fact, the first instances of rocket propulsion were way back in the year 1100, when the Chinese actually used rocket motors to accelerate their arrows and increase their range. And since then, rocketry has also been heavily intertwined with the expansion of weapon systems and conflict in general. So, moving on from those early instances of rocketry using solid motors on a really small scale, there were other instances of it being used on rocket propulsion being used as a weapon. For instance, I think it was in the year 1400. It was the British Navy realized that the rocketry could be effectively used for sea-to-land bombardments with small unguided missiles. And then moving on forward, you also had the advent of liquid propulsion in 1926, and things like the V-2 guided bomb, which was a rocket-propelled. It was actually an IRBM, a short-range ballistic missile used to strike from mainland Europe against Britain. So I'm going to be going into the science today about what enables a rocket-propelled vehicle to be stable, the different forms of propulsion, and I'll be actually going into there's this game that heavily simulates the physics behind those kind of things, and I'll be showing you basically just the physics, what enables it to fly. So there are a few key factors that enable vehicles that use rocket propulsion to fly. For one thing, there's the engine itself. So first off, the engine has to be able to support both the weight of the payload and the weight of the fuel it's carrying. And this is what's known as the rocket conundrum, where in order to get more distance, you add more fuel, but the fuel you're adding has mass, and you need more fuel to carry the mass of the fuel you added, but that fuel also has mass, and eventually you get to the point where you either need to make the engine for the vehicle bigger or make it more efficient. And in a world where launch vehicles are already really, really, really stinking big, the only way left to go is efficiency. The other thing is aerodynamic stability, because you can't just start with something already outside the atmosphere. We have to build it here on Earth and launch it. So, when it comes to aerodynamic stability, there are a few different things. So I'm just going to draw a little model here. This is not actually what a real launch vehicle looks like. They're usually, a lot more complex. But so, let's just say I'm going to say this is solid fuel here. I'm not going to do anything really complex with it yet. So this, right now, is actually inherently unstable. So you have two main characteristics. The center of mass, well, three, sorry. The center of mass, which is the balance point of the vehicle. If you were to gently rest that vehicle on a tiny little, something the size of like a piece of paper, where it would balance at stably is the center of mass. So let's say this is your payload here, the rest of this is fuel for that motor. The fuel's going to be pretty heavy, so the center of mass would probably be somewhere around here, right? The other thing to note is the center of lift. The center of lift, otherwise known as the center of drag, which is what we're dealing here with a launch vehicle that doesn't really produce any lift using aerodynamic surfaces, is where the air interacting with the vehicle creates the most drag. Now, this does have a nose cap, which makes it a little bit more dynamic than if it was just a cylinder, but it's still mostly a cylinder, which means it's going to experience some aerodynamic instability straight out of the box. Cylinders tend to want to fall on their side, where they're the most aerodynamic due to the curved shape of the cylinder. Air wants to rush around the cylinder on its side rather than this pointed nose cone. So without fins, your center of lift is going to be really close to the center of mass, and in some cases even at the center of mass. The closer the center of lift is to the center of mass, the less stable the vehicle itself becomes aerodynamically, but at the same time, that instability allows it to torque a bit more. So, say we have a really close center of lift, like right here. The vehicle has a lot of turning power, but you also have to watch out for the fact that it's heavily unstable. So in the right conditions, it could easily flip over and become uncontrollable. You never want the center of lift to be above the center of mass, because then your vehicle is stable, traveling the opposite direction it should be. So given any chance, it will always flip over and want to fly the opposite direction. The lower the center of mass, or the lower the center of lift is compared to the center of mass, the more stable the vehicle will be. The easiest way to move the center of lift is to provide more drag points, in this case, fins. And yes, I know I'm not that good at drawing. What this does, though, is it gives more places for the air to interact with the vehicle, and it lowers the center of lift, making the vehicle more inherently stable. So I'm actually going to stop here and move over to the simulator I was talking about and show you this in a real-world scenario. Alright, so going off what we were just talking about back at the whiteboard, I'm going to be working with a quick test real quick. So first off, here we have a vehicle just like what we were talking about over at the whiteboard. It's nothing much, just a simple cylinder filled with solid fuel, an engine nozzle, and command and control stuff, as well as our body here has a nose cone on top. So, right now, the game isn't showing it because there's no aerodynamic surfaces on this, so it's screaming at me, but what you should be able to see, although we can't right now, is that the center of lift would be right close to, if not at, the center of gravity. So we're not completely unstable, but we're pretty darn close. Like, if I launch this real quick, once we get going fast enough, it's pretty hard to, but I can turn this quite a bit. It's pretty unstable and crashes fairly easily. So, one way we can fix this and make this a bit more stable aerodynamically is by going to aerodynamics and grabbing some fins. Now,
watch what happens to our center of lift when I put some fins on it. For one thing, it actually appears, because now we have aerodynamic surfaces. And for another, it's hanging out right around where these fins are, because they're our widest point on the craft and produce the most drag, which means that's where the craft will be aerodynamically stable. So, the closer we get it to the center of mass, like I was talking about earlier, the more unstable the craft becomes, but the more responsive it becomes to inputs. So if we put him down near here, as you'll see when I launch this, our craft becomes really stable, but what'll happen is, I won't get as much control over it. I'm putting full yaw and it's barely turning because of the aerodynamics of it. But now, if I were to revert, not to launch, dang it. If I were to revert to VAB for a second here, and let me turn center of mass lift back on. If I were to place these up a bit, you'll see we're not going to be the most stable anymore. We're at more risk of tumbling. But what happens is, the higher center of lift means the craft becomes a lot more responsive even once we get going, as you can see. I could turn a lot better than I did at this speed than I could with those all the way down there. It's because, in fact, on fighter aircraft, like the F-22 for instance, usually have their center of lift a bit closer to the center of mass than something like a Cessna, because they need to have faster response time and more pitch and yaw input in order to pull off the insane maneuvers they do. Another thing to note is mass offset. So here we have our center of mass, and to start with, it's lined up right down the center of our craft because it's perfectly balanced mass-wise. We also have our center of thrust, and as you can see, it's perfectly centered as well, because the only thing producing thrust and the only thing having mass are all lined up. Now, what I could do is I could move the center of mass by placing, let's just take this radial ore tank here. For one thing, what it does is it throws our center of mass off to the left. You can see our center of mass and thrust are no longer aligned. And if I fill this, it moves farther and farther as the weight is no longer centered on the body of the spacecraft itself. Now, if we were to launch this, what'll happen is it'll start torquing around that center of mass, because now the center of thrust is not only providing thrust, but it's also providing a slight amount of rotation. And by slight, I mean that much rotation. Note, I did not touch any controls except for the stage button to ignite that engine. So now I'm going to revert to the VAB again. Another thing to note would be delta V. So right now you can see, I can't remember if I talked about the rocket conundrum or not. I think I did. But basically, the more mass you add to your craft, the more fuel you need to lift that mass, but eventually adding that fuel adds even more mass, and the only way to counteract that is to add a bigger engine or a more efficient engine. In this case, these SRBs are very not efficient. Like, this is a solid motor, and unlike a liquid motor which uses a pair of liquid propellants, a solid motor is basically black powder or gunpowder packed down tight to provide thrust when it burns. So, as you can see, even with these things empty, we've lost over 1 kilometer per second of delta V, and delta V is how much you can change your velocity. So, in a perfect world with no atmosphere and no gravity right now, I would be able to speed up from from 0 meters per second to 1,592 meters per second with this, and then I wouldn't be able to change my velocity anymore. I could rotate around, sure, because it's a reaction wheel, but I would not be able to accelerate or decelerate. Now, what I can do to increase my delta V, for one thing, is to remove these. Another thing would be to use a more efficient form of propulsion. So we're gonna find that here. So now we have liquid fuel in the form of, so these are Kerolox engines, meaning they use kerosene and liquid oxygen. And oh dang it, I'm gonna grab a spark engine here. So now we're using a more efficient form of fuel and a more efficient engine than we were with the SRB. So now we actually get more delta V, and in this case, this vehicle could actually make orbit with the right piloting skills, which I do have, I think. But if we were to add 2 more of these fuel tanks, it should proportionally add another third of our delta V, right? Wrong, it only gives us 300 more meters per second. And the reason is because, just like I was saying earlier, we're experiencing the rocket conundrum. We're adding more fuel, but that fuel has mass, so we're getting less bang for our buck trying to move that much fuel. The way to fix this, just like we did a second ago, would be to use a more efficient fuel source, or engine, which we're using both of. Now we have the same kind of setup before, except we've replaced those liquid fuel and oxidizer tanks with xenon tanks, and our liquid fuel and oxidizer engine, our Kerolox engine, with an ion engine, which uses power to ionize and accelerate xenon to a very fast velocity. Now, in a vacuum, this thing gets like 30 kilometers per second. It's insane. The problem, though, is there's a tiny thrust-to-weight ratio. So, and especially at sea level, it can't even get off the pad. So while it is more efficient, the reason we use less efficient propellants is because they have more power behind them and are enable us to get our more efficient forms of propulsion outside the atmosphere and into orbit. For instance, let's say we have this tiny little ion-powered probe that in a vacuum has 7 kilometers per second. Sheesh. We're going to, first off, give it a bit more power, because craft like this need a lot of power, because the ion engine uses a lot of power. And of course, some solar panels to recharge that battery. So already adding just that mass has given us has dropped it by almost 1 kilometer per second, because this thing is not very thrusty. So even though it's efficient, it's still really hard for it to move that mass. And it only has a thrust-to-weight ratio of 0.42, which means it couldn't even lift half the weight that it weighs stably. Or I mean, it can in 0 gravity, but if we switch over to sea level, close to the ground, it barely has 1.5. It barely has 156 meters per second. That's not nearly good enough to get it into orbit. So what we do is we would no, that's too big. Oh my gosh. Where is? Oh my gosh. I can't find it. Is that it? No. Alright, I'm switching sizes. Why special device that makes the vehicle as a whole more aerodynamic, covering the heavily aerodynamic payload we have here. And in fact, because we did that, we can actually remove that nose cone and drop the mass a little, and now we have a nose cone that'll go away so that we can deploy our craft. And we can do that all in one stage. Okay, so what we need. So, like I was talking about a minute ago, we need some form of mid-level propulsion, a sustainer, if you will, to get this thing through the atmosphere. So, the swivel is a good sustainer, and that already at moderate altitude has like almost a kilometer per second in it. So now, under that, we would add some sort of booster, a heavy stage that would get it out of the thicker parts of the atmosphere, and when it's out of fuel, be dropped to save on mass, because you don't want to be dragging empty fuel tanks around with you. So now we can pretty much make it to orbit. We have our first stage, our booster, that at sea level gets us really high out of the atmosphere. We could probably get to around 50 kilometers on that. At that point, we'd have like a kilometer, 1100 meters per second on that second stage, which would get us almost to orbit, and then we could use our more efficient vacuum engine there to get it into orbit, and then wherever it wants to go through. So that's efficiency, and another thing about efficiency is how you get an engine to be more efficient in a certain level of atmosphere is to make that engine's chamber pressure. You see this gray area? That's the combustion chamber. You can change like the throat width of the nozzle, among other things, and the chamber pressure to get the output to match similar to the atmospheric conditions. You want to turn high pressure, low velocity gases into low pressure, very high velocity gases, a jet of exhaust to propel you. And the more the pressure of the exhaust matches the pressure of the atmosphere you're in, the more efficient it is. So, in this case, at 101.325 kilopascals, that's how much pressure we want coming out of that engine. So, what's wrong? Oh, never mind. So, the more efficient this, the more like the atmosphere the exhaust is, the more efficient it is. So these ones have pretty high chamber pressures because they're more designed for atmospheric flight. Whereas this one literally has a chamber pressure of 0, or like a tiny fraction of the atmosphere, because it's mainly just chucking out a trickle of gases that ridiculous, like the gases coming out of an ion engine are at like 50 kilometers per second. Like they're nearly interstellar themselves, just powering this thing. So, anyway, that's all I wanted to say about overexpansion and underexpansion. About chamber pressure. And actually, I'll dive a little more into that back in the whiteboard in just a minute now. Or more like a second for you guys.
Alright, so, like I was saying back at the computer, different engines are designed for different efficiencies. So in the case of the sea level to vacuum efficiency, engines that are designed for sea level use, like the big double bell one I was pulling out, have let me just draw an example here. generally have very short rocket nozzles, like because and will run at very high chamber pressures because they want to be more like the atmosphere they're in. Because the more like the atmosphere it's in it is, the more efficient it is. Of course, this decreases the engine's overall efficiency, but engines designed for a vacuum with big nozzles and low chamber pressure will actually be way less efficient at sea level. In fact, that ion engine suffers very heavily from vacuum to sea level efficiency. And if an ion engine was used at sea level, it would barely have like a meter per second of delta V, regardless of how much fuel you put in it. So one thing about rocket engines is they're actually characterized as a form of jet engine. And I know that may surprise you, it's because they use the same principles. A jet engine isn't referring to the type of engine itself, it's referring to the exhaust method, where for propulsion, both a jet engine and a rocket engine concentrate the combustion leftovers, the exhaust, into a concentrated jet that they use to provide propulsion in the opposite direction the jet's firing. In the case of a jet engine, it uses intake air from the atmosphere, the oxygen from it. It compresses it down into a more usable form, mixes it with fuel from a series of pipes, so you have all this air coming into the engine. It mixes with fuel in this area, and then is passed over a burner. And what the burner does is it ignites the fuel-oxygen reaction and causes the whole thing to heat up and expand. And what you get is a concentrated jet of hot gases coming out the rear of the jet engine that propels the whole thing forward. Now, a rocket engine is very, very similar, except in the case of the rocket engine, instead of because they usually have to operate in very high altitude or even completely outside the atmosphere, they don't have any form of intake air. So instead, you have what's called a closed cycle engine, where it has this combustion chamber here, and this combustion chamber, rather than running off intake air and fuel, runs off a main fuel and then an oxidizer, usually something like liquid oxygen. These two combine together in a certain ratio inside this reaction chamber and are combusted and then fed out the engine nozzle. And all the engine nozzle is for is to make your reaction a bit more efficient, because all these jet reactions is gases that have been heated up and combusted expanding. The point of a rocket nozzle is to direct most of that expansion, because gases want to expand in every direction that's available. What the rocket nozzle does is it makes it so that the only direction that the gases can expand is the direction you want to give you propulsion. I know that was a pretty bad drawing. Not the best at drawing in this case. Alright, that's all for today. Today's donation goal is going to be $100. Or, not today, this video's donation goal. If $100 is raised, then I'll do the next video in this series and cover more topics, such as orbital physics and correction, and more difficult things like, for instance, how they got the space shuttle to work. Because, like I was talking about earlier, that extreme thrust offset is actually a serious problem, considering the fact that the vehicle was hanging off the side of the main engine stack. Alright, so that's all for now.